Okay, so there was a journalist from Time magazine who went to the Supreme Court hearing on the rights of trans youth, and she wrote about her experience. So I want to read part of this article, and then afterwards I'm going to talk about all this. All right, Time magazine. What struck me most that day wasn't just the hostility, it was the contradiction. The people claiming they were there to save women's sports seemed to know almost nothing about them. And that contradiction reveals something deeper about this debate. This fight was never really about fairness in athletics. It was about who is allowed to belong. On Instagram and TikTok, I make content about women's sports that reaches millions of people. I tell stories about women athletes that I wish the mainstream media spent more time covering, and whenever I can, I highlight queer joy in sports. So you can imagine my surprise at seeing signs reading "Save Women's Sports" or "Protect Women's Sports," and learning that women's sports apparently needs rescuing. I turned to my friend and fellow content creator Ali O'Brien and joked that many of these protesters probably don't even watch women's sports. She's talking about the protesters that were at this Supreme Court hearing. Riley Gaines was one of them. She laughed, then suggested something better. Why not ask them? Can they name 5 women currently playing professional sports? So we walked straight into the crowd of signs invoking biology, reality, sex, and Jesus. The pattern became clear almost immediately. The first man I approached agreed to be recorded. When I asked whether he could name 5 professional women athletes, he said no. A woman holding a purple "Save Women's Sports" sign offered the Williams sisters, only one of whom still competes. After a pause, she admitted she couldn't think of anyone else. Another woman holding a sign that read, "Stop transing gay kids." This is Riley Gaines, a former college swimmer whose public profile now rests largely on opposing trans inclusion in sports, not on competing professionally. Near the end of our interviews, Ali asked a man holding a "Protect Women's Sports" sign if he could name women athletes, and he said, "I don't watch women's sports." So again and again, the people claiming to protect women's sports acknowledged they didn't follow them. They knew little about athletes they were supposedly saving, except that those athletes somehow needed protection from trans girls. Inside the court, the justices were considering whether states can legally exclude trans athletes in the name of fairness. As a fan of women's sports, I find that prospect deeply troubling, not just for trans athletes, but for the values women's sports were built on. Women's sports were not founded on exclusion. They were created to correct it. They exist because women were once told they didn't belong on the field, the court, or the track. Inclusion is not a threat to women's sports. It is their very reason for being. Discussions about trans athletes often begin with statistics. This framing has always made me uneasy. In 2024, out of over 500,000 college athletes, less than 10 of them were trans. This year, there are likely even fewer. In February 2025, the NCAA banned trans women student athletes from competition, saying in a news release, a student athlete assigned male at birth may not compete for an NCAA women's team. Defending a marginalized group by emphasizing how small it is suggests that harm becomes acceptable at a certain scale. Those protesting to oppose the inclusion of trans women and girls often cast themselves as victims or part of a small minority group. But to me, 10 athletes was never an insignificant number. Even if there was only one trans athlete in the country, I would still have been standing on those steps. Critics of trans inclusion typically frame their grievances as an issue of fairness, but this perspective reveals a total lack of understanding about how sports, men's or women's, operates. Do people realize how many aspects of sports are inherently unfair? Does Katie Ledecky not possess a biological advantage as she laps elite swimmers? Does Simone Biles, the most decorated gymnast of all time, not have the ideal body type for gymnastics? Is four-time WNBA MVP A'ja Wilson's height on the basketball court unfair? Okay, so this is a point I am constantly making. Athletic bans are making women's and girls' sports unsafe. Men want to police women's bodies and decide what is appropriate and what is a woman and what is not. Trans women and cisgender women come in all shapes and sizes, so if it's about size alone, then you would have to then ban taller girls, wider girls, muscular girls, etc. Not only that, but Republicans are proposing to check little girls and women's genitals before being allowed in a bathroom. Obviously, this is trauma-inducing, predatory, and sexually abusive. But that is how Republican men operate. They want to control women, their bodies, and their decisions. Just look at Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, Jeffrey Epstein, Matt Gaetz, Brett Kavanaugh, Steve Bannon. These are all predators of young girls that run in the same circle. The organizations that are attacking trans rights are funded by billionaires who are friends with Donald Trump. This is the beginning of an authoritarian genocide of trans people in the US, according to multiple genocide experts. All right, let me get back to the article. The fact that anti-trans protesters don't watch women's sports also matters because it quickly becomes clear that they have not considered how the policies they are advocating for would be implemented into practice and how they threaten to put all women and girls at risk. Given the long, troubling history of sex testing in women's sports, how would these bans even be enforced, especially among minors? Who gets to decide which girls look trans? And why do those accusations so often fall disproportionately on women of color? So, side note here, sex testing costs between $1,000 and $15,000 per athlete. This is what Republicans want to do, yet they have no plan for where they're going to get all that money. Republicans are falsely claiming that cisgender women in athletics are transgender just based on their looks. They're so uneducated, probably have never met a trans person. They don't know that there are passing trans women of all shapes and sizes, and cisgender women too. Just so uneducated and sheltered from reality. Republicans claim that Michelle Obama was trans. These people love conspiracies. They thought Hillary Clinton was eating babies in a basement, for God's sake. So, and of course Riley Gaines was there to stalk trans people again. So her sign, doesn't matter what it said, but it showed she clearly doesn't know the difference between a homosexual man and a transgender woman. And she brought her political prop, her new baby Hellspawn. So these people know nothing about women's sports, just like they know nothing about gender and sexual orientation. Their stupidity is embarrassing to watch. They think they're God's gift to corruption. Thank you for listening. Please like this video, leave your comments, share this. I'll be back very soon.